The 1970s were marked by a large number of major international terrorist attacks, including the Lord Airport massacre and the Munich Olympics massacre in 1972 and the Entebbe hostage-taking in 1976, with over 100 Jewish hostages of different nationalities kidnapped and held in Uganda. The Lord Airport Massacre. The Lord Airport Massacre was a terrorist attack that occurred on 30th May 1972, in which 3 members of the Japanese Red Army, recruited by a Palestinian group called the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine External Operations, attacked Lord Airport, now a Ben Gurion International Airport near Tel Aviv, killing 26 people and injuring 80 others. 2 of the attackers were killed, while a third, Kozo Okamoto, was captured after being wounded. The dead comprised 17 Christian pilgrims from Puerto Rico, a Canadian citizen, and 8 Israelis, including Professor Ron Katzir, an internationally renowned protein biophysicist. Katzir was the head of Israel National Academy of Science and a popular scientific radio show host. He was also a candidate in the upcoming Israeli president election. His brother, Ephraim Katzir, was elected president of Israel the following year. Because the airport security was focused on the possibility of Palestine attack, the use of Japanese attacker took the guards by surprise. The attack has often been described as a suicide mission, but it also has been asserted that it was an outcome of an unpublicized larger operations that went awry. The hijacking of Lufthansa Flight 649 was an act of terrorism committed by a Palestine group that took place between 22 and 23 February 1972. Eventually, all hostages on the board, the seized Boeing 747-230B, were released when the West German government paid a ransom of $5 million. The Munich massacre was an attack during the 1972 Summer Olympics in Munich, West Germany, by 8 members of the Palestinian terrorist group Black September, who took 9 members of Israeli Olympic team hostage after killing 2 of them. Black September called the operation Ikrit and Biram after 2 Palestinian Christian villages whose inhabitants were expelled by Israel Defense Forces during 1948 Arab-Israeli War. The Black September commander was Latif Afif, who was also negotiator. West German neo-Nazis gave the group logistical assistance. Shortly after the hostages were taken, Afif demanded the release of 234 Palestinian prisoners in the Israeli jail, and the West German held founders of the Red Army faction, Andreas Badar and Ulrich Minoff. 5 of the 8 Black September members were killed during a failed attempt to rescue the hostages, all of whom were killed. A West German policeman was also killed in the crossfire. The 3 surviving perpetrators were Adnan al-Ghashi, Jamal al-Ghashi, and Mohammad Safadi, who were arrested. The next month, however, following the hijacking of Lufthansa Flight 615, the West German government released them in hostage exchange. The Israeli government launched the Operation Wrath of God, which authorized Mossad to track down and kill those involved in Munich massacre. On 27 June 1976, an Air France Airbus A300 jet airliner with 248 passengers was hijacked by 2 members of Popular Front of Liberation of Palestine External Operations under the orders of Wadi Haddad and 2 members of German Revolutionary Cell. The hijackers' stated objective was to free 14 Palestinian and affiliated militants imprisoned in Israel and 13 prisoners in 4 other countries in exchange for hostages. The flight, which had originated in Tel Aviv with a destination Paris, was diverted after a stopover in Athens via Benghazi to Entebbe, the main airport of Uganda. The Ugandan government supported the hijackers, and the dictator Idi Amin, who had been informed of the hijacking from the beginning, personally welcomed them. After moving all hostages from the aircraft to disused airport building, the hijackers separated all Israelis and several non-Israeli Jews from the larger group and forced them into a separate room. Over the following 2 days, 148 non-Israeli hostages were released and flown out of the Paris. 94, mainly Israelis, passengers along with 12-member Air France crew remained as the hostage and were threatened with the death. IDF acted on information provided by Israeli intelligence agency Mossad. The hijacker threatened to kill the hostages if their prisoners' release demands were not met. This threat led to planning of rescue operation. This plan included preparation for armed resistance from the Uganda army. The operation took place at night. Israeli transport plane carried 100 commandos over 4,000 kilometers to Uganda for the rescue operation. The operation, which took weeks of planning, lasted 90 minutes. Of 106 remaining hostages, 102 were rescued and 3 were killed. The other hostages was in hospital and was later killed. 5 Israeli commandos were wounded and 1 unit commander, Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Netanyahu, was killed. Netanyahu was the older brother of Benjamin Netanyahu, who would later become Prime Minister of Israel. All the hijackers and 45 Ugandan soldiers were killed, and 11 Soviet-built MiG-17s and MiG-21s of Ugandan Air Force were destroyed. Kenyan sources supported Israel, and in aftermath of operation, Idi Amin issued orders to retaliate and slaughter several hundred Kenyans then present in Uganda. There were 245 Kenyans in Uganda killed and 3,000 fled. Operation Entebbe, which had the military code name Operation Thunderbolt, is sometimes referred to retroactively as Operation Jonathan in memory of unit leader Jonathan Netanyahu. In coming years, the suicide attack would become one of the most potent weapons used by Palestine terrorists against the Israeli Defense Forces. The PLO, driven from Jordan, resettled in Lebanon, where it began to extend a de facto autonomous rule and from which it staged raids into Israel. PLO was one of the major factors for sectarian destabilization of Lebanon, of the Lebanese Civil War in 1975. In 1978, Israel launched Operation Litani, in which it, together with the Free Lebanon Army, forced the PLO to retreat north of Litani River. In 1981, another conflict between Israel and PLO broke out, which ended with a ceasefire agreement that did not solve the core of the conflict. The nature of conflict has shifted over the years from large-scale regional Arab-Israeli conflict to the more of local Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which peaked during 1982 Lebanon War. It's also called the First Lebanon War. In June 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon in alliance with the Christian faction of the Lebanese government. Within 2 months, the PLO agreed to withdraw. Despite this, Israeli success in eradicating PLO bases and its partial withdrawal in 1985, the Israeli invasion increased the severity of conflict with local Lebanese militias and resulted in the consolidation of several local Shia Muslim movements in Lebanon, including Hezbollah and Amal, from the previously organized guerrilla movement in the south. Over the years, military casualties of both sides grew higher as both parties used more modern weaponry and the Hezbollah progressed in its tactics. By early 1990s, Hezbollah, with support from Syria and Iran, emerged as the leading group and a military power in monopolizing guerrilla activity in the South Lebanon. After the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, the idea of Hezbollah arose among Lebanese clerics who had studied in Nazaf and who adopted the model set of all the Ayatollah Khomeini after the Iranian Revolution in 1979. The organization was established as a part of Iranian effort through funding and the dispatch of core group of Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps instructors to aggregate a variety of Lebanese Shia groups into unified organization to resist the Israeli occupation and improve the standing and the status of long marginalized and underrepresented Shia community in that country. A contingent of 1,500 Pasdaran instructors arrived from Syrian government, which occupied Lebanon's eastern highland, permitted their transit to the base in Bekaa Valley. Hezbollah's military strength has grown so significantly since 2006 that its paramilitary wing is considered more powerful than Lebanese army. Hezbollah has been described as the state within a state and has grown into an organization with seats in Lebanese government, a radio and a satellite TV station, social services, and a large-scale military deployment of fighters beyond Lebanon borders. Over the years, military casualties of both sides grew higher as parties used more modern weaponry and Hezbollah progressed in its tactics. By the early 1990s, Hezbollah, with support of Syria and Iran, emerged as the leading group and military power, monopolizing guerrilla activity in southern Lebanon. Hamas was established in 1987 and has its origins in Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood movement, which had been active in Gaza Strip. In the 1980s, the Brotherhood emerged as a powerful political factor, challenging the influence of the PLO, and in 1987 adopted a more nationalist and activist line under the name of Hamas. During the 1900s and early 2000s, the organization conducted numerous suicide bombings and other attacks against Israel. The January 2006 legislative elections marked another victory for Hamas, which gained the majority of seats, defeating the ruling Fatah party. Hamas obtained 42.9% of the vote and 74 of the 132 seats. After the formation of Hamas-led cabinet on March 20, 2006, tensions between Fatah and Hamas militants progressively rose in the Gaza Strip, leading to demonstration, violence, and repeated attempts at the truce. Due to internal conflict between Hamas and Fatah, which led to full-fledged war of Gaza, Israel imposed an economic blockade on Gaza, and Hamas repeatedly launched attacks upon the areas of Israel near its border with Gaza because of the blockade. At least 600 Palestinians died in fighting between Hamas and Fatah. By the year 2000, following an election campaign promise, newly elected Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Barak, unilaterally withdrew Israeli forces from southern Lebanon within a year. In accordance with the UN Security Council Resolution 425 passed in 1978, the withdrawal consequently resulted in the immediate total collapse of South Lebanese army, with many of its members escaping to Israel. The Lebanese government and Hezbollah still consider the withdrawal incomplete until Israel withdraws from Sheba farms. Following the withdrawal, Hezbollah has monopolized its military and civil control of the southern part of the Lebanon. All told, from summer 2000, after Israel withdrawal, until summer 2006, Hezbollah conducted approximately 200 attacks on Israel, most of them artillery fire, some raids, some via proxy inside Israel. In these attacks, including the attack that precipitated the Israel response that developed into a war, 31 Israelis were killed and 104 were wounded. In 1922, Israel retrospectively recognized the conflict as a war. With the decline of 1987-1993 First Palestinian Intifada, the interim Oslo Accords led to creation of Palestine National Authority in 1994 within the context of Israeli-Palestinian peace process. The Oslo II Agreement was signed in 1995 and detailed the division of West Bank into areas A, B and C. Areas A was a land under full Palestinian civil control, and Palestinians were also responsible for internal security. The Oslo agreements remain important documents in Israeli-Palestinian relations. The same year, Israel and Jordan reached a peace accord. In 2002, the Arab League offered a recognition of Israel by Arab countries as a part of a resolution of the Palestine-Israel conflict in Arab Peace Initiative. The initiative, which has been confirmed since, calls for normalization relation between the Arab League and the Israel in exchange for full withdrawal by Israel from the occupied territories, including East Jerusalem, and the just settlement of Palestinian refugee problem based on UN Resolution 194. In the 1990s and early 2000s, a ceasefire had been largely maintained between the Israel and Ba'ath Syria as well as with the Lebanon. The Al-Aqsa Intifada forced Israel to rethink its relationship and policy towards the Palestine. Following a series of suicide bombing and the attacks, the Israeli army launched an Operation Defensive Shield in March 2002. It was the largest military operation conducted by Israel since Six-Day War. As the violence between the Israeli army and Palestinian military intensified, Israel expanded its security apparatus around the West Bank by retaking many parts of land in Area A. Israel then Prime Minister Ariel Sharon began a policy of disengagement from the Gaza Strip in 2003. This policy was fully implemented in August 2005. Sharon's announcement to disengage from Gaza came as a tremendous shock to his critics both on left and on the right. The Iran-Israel conflict during the Syrian civil war refers to the Iranian-Israeli standoff in and around Syria during the course of Syrian conflict, with increasing Iranian involvement in Syria from 2011 onwards. The conflict shifted from proxy war into a direct confrontation by early 2018. Developments in the course of Syrian civil war reshuffled the situation near Israel's northern border, putting the Syrian Arab Republic, Hezbollah, and the Syrian opposition at the odds with each other and complicating their relationship with Israel upon the emerging warfare with Iran. The conflict between Israel and Hamas-ruled Gaza is also attributed to the Iran-Israel proxy conflict with the region. By 2017, Israel and several Arab Sunni states, led by Saudi Arabia, formed a semi-official coalition to confront Iran. This move and the Israeli normalization of Gulf state was marked by some as fading of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Today, tensions are often high between Israel and Palestine living in East Jerusalem, Gaza, and the West Bank. Gaza is ruled by the Palestinian militant group Hamas, which has fought Israel many times. Israel and Egypt tightly control Gaza's border to stop weapons getting into Hamas. Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank say they are suffering because of Israeli action and restriction. Israel says it is only acting to protect itself from Palestinian violence. Things have escalated since the start of Holy Muslim month of Ramadan in mid-April 2021, with nightly clashes between police and Palestinians. The threatened eviction of some of Palestinian families in East Jerusalem has also caused the rising anger. Today, there are a number of issues which Israel and Palestinians cannot agree on. These include what should happen to Palestinian refugees, whether Jewish settlement in the occupied West Bank should stay or be removed, whether the two sides should share Jerusalem, and perhaps most tricky of all, whether a Palestinian state should be created alongside Israel. Peace talks have been taking place on and off for more than 25 years, but so far have not solved the conflict. What does the future hold? In short, the situation isn't going to be sorted out any time soon. The most recent peace plan prepared by United States when Donald Trump was the president, called the deal of the century by Israeli PM Benjamin Netanyahu, has been dismissed by Palestinians as one-sided and never got off the ground. Any future peace deal will need both sides to agree and resolve complex issues. It says that the latest round of violence is the fourth big war between Hamas and Israel since 2008. Similar things have been said by both sides in claiming victory, and then eventually the seeds of next conflicts are sown.